Welcome, friends. I'm here with an adventurous science fiction story. In this episode, we'll hear the story of Daniel and the alien woman Mila. If you're ready, Sci-Fi Traveler is about to begin. Enjoy the show. I shared my meal with an alien woman, and the next day there were dozens of alien women at my door. The wind on the Kesset Plateau had been sanding the same 3 rocks for 4,000 years and had every intention of finishing the job, and Daniel had long ago stopped taking it personally. It came down off the northern scarp every evening at the same hour, dry as an auditor's handshake, and it found the gaps in his stone house the way water finds a crack in a boot. He'd sealed those gaps 11 times. The wind had unsealed them 12. He'd stopped counting that particular battle, which was remarkable, because Daniel counted everything else. He was counting now. The root cellar smelled of cold earth and faint sweetness, and he stood at the bottom of the ladder with a slate in one hand and a stub of graphite in the other, moving down the bins. 41 tubers, the pale-ridged kind the seed catalog had optimistically called sunrise gold, and which tasted like a potato that had heard a rumor about butter. 2 braids of onion. A crate of protein bricks stamped with an expiry date that had been a suggestion at best. 9 jars of the pickled thing Daniel had made 2 winters ago and had never once been brave enough to identify. 41. He wrote it down. He wrote the date beside it. He drew the small, neat box around the number that he always drew, because a number in a box was a number that had been dealt with, and a number that had been dealt with couldn't keep you awake at 3 in the morning doing arithmetic against the ceiling. Above him, something ground its gears in a manner that suggested profound emotional distress. Daniel. The drone's voice came down the ladder shaft like a bucket of nails. It was called a Kassar Kelb Model 9 Autonomous Agricultural Unit, and it had been called that by people who had never met one. Daniel called it Kelb. It was the size of a wheelbarrow, shaped like a barrel that had given up, and it had a vocabulary chip from a previous owner who'd apparently used it for something involving either poetry or lawsuits. Daniel. I have performed the irrigation survey. The irrigation survey. That is what I said. You've never once said it. The survey is complete, Kelb continued, in the tone of a man refusing to acknowledge a heckler. The north field is dying. The south field is dying. The east field is already dead, and I believe it is time we held a service. Thank you, Kelb. I have prepared some remarks. Daniel climbed the ladder. 9 years he'd been out here, at the frayed edge of the frontier where the Concorde's maps went vague and honest, and just said plateau in small gray letters, as if the cartographers had shrugged and gone to lunch. The old freight road ran past his boundary stones, a scar of packed dust and fused gravel laid down by machines that were now scrap in a ditch somewhere, and every few days something came along it. Ore haulers, pilgrim buses with their windows filmed over. Once, memorably, a man riding an actual horse who had waved. They passed. They never stopped. There was nothing out here to stop for, which was the entire and complete reason Daniel had chosen it off a homestead registry, with his eyes shut and his heart shut tighter. He was setting the pot on the burner when the wind changed. Not the sound of it, the shape of it. A wind that has been going around a house for 9 years has a shape, and when something stands in it, the shape breaks. He looked at the door for a while before he opened it. She was standing 3 paces back, which he understood later was a courtesy, and which at the time only made her look like a thing the dusk had assembled and hadn't finished. Her skin was gold, not paint, not sickness, but a real warm, luminous gold, the color of late sunlight lying flat across wheat, the color that makes farmers stop working for a second and forget why. Her hair was dark and wind-wrecked. Her ears swept back and up into long, elegant points, and one of them was notched, an old scar gone silver. She was upright. That was the thing he noticed most, and the thing he'd remember longest. She was upright the way a fence post is upright after the fence is gone, out of habit and sheer geometry, with nothing left holding it. Her eyes were sunk into shadow, and her hands hung open at her sides, and she swayed, very slightly on the offbeat of the wind. She did not ask. She stood in his doorway with her chin level and her mouth shut, and she did not ask. And Daniel had spent enough of his life around ledgers to recognize a person who had decided she would rather starve than be a line item in someone else's charity. He knew that posture. He'd seen 8,000 people hold it once, in a corridor that smelled of recycled air. "You're letting the heat out," he said. Then he turned around and walked back to his stove, leaving the door open behind him, because a door held open is a question, and a door walked away from is not. He heard her come in. He heard her stop. He did not look. He took the second plate down from the shelf, the one that had been on that shelf for 9 years, unused, because a man buys plates in pairs and then finds out what he's actually bought. And he set it on the table opposite his own, and he laid the fork beside it, and he divided the pot in half. Not a generous half, the exact half. He was very good at exact halves. It was the skill that had ruined his life. "Sit down," he said, "or don't, but I'm not eating twice." She sat down. She ate slowly. She ate with a terrible, disciplined slowness that told him more than any story could have. And the whole time, the entire meal, every bite, she watched him, not the food, him. Steady gold eyes over the rim of the plate. Waiting. He knew what she was waiting for. She was waiting for the price. For the moment he'd set down his fork and lean back and say now. And name it. Because there is always a now. And there is always a name. And out here on the frayed edge, the name is usually ugly. Daniel ate his half. He asked her nothing. Not where she'd come from, not what she was, not how far a person had to walk to arrive at a door looking like that. He got up and put the kettle on, and poured 2 cups of something that was legally tea in only 4 systems, and set one in front of her. And then he went and sat by the stove with his own, and watched the fire and let her be a person in a warm room with no one looking at her. Behind him, he heard her breathe out. It was a small sound. It went through him like a nail. "There's a bed in the back," he said to the fire. "It's got a mattress that hates you, but it's warmer than out there. Nothing's expected." He didn't hear her answer and hadn't expected one. In the morning, she was gone. The wind had swept the doorstep clean of any print she might have left, which was the wind's one act of discretion in 4,000 years. The bed in the back was made up so neatly it looked accusatory, and the second plate, washed, dried, and set back on the shelf exactly where it had lived for 9 years, tucked half an inch out of true by a hand that didn't know his habits. Daniel stood looking at it for a long moment with his slate in his hand. Then he put the slate down on the table, without writing anything on it, and went out to see about the pumps. It was the first thing in 9 years he did not count. He knew before he opened the door, because Kelb told him, and Kelb had never in 3 years told him anything worth knowing. "Daniel." The drone was at the threshold, vibrating in a way that its manual described as diagnostic idle, and Daniel had come to read as panic. "Daniel, there is a crowd." "There's no such thing as a crowd out here." "I am aware. I have run the survey 4 times. The survey is unhappy." He opened the door. The plateau at dawn was the color of dishwater and always had been. A flat gray nothing rolling out to the scarp, with the freight road cut through it like a badly healed seam. That morning, the nothing had people standing in it. Dozens of them. They stood in loose ranks out past his boundary stones and up the slope of the dead east field, still as fence posts, wrapped in dust-colored cloth, and every single one of them was gold-skinned and long-eared, and every single one of them was looking at his door. Daniel's first coherent thought was that he had 11 days of food. His second was that he should close the door, which he did quietly, and stand in his own kitchen with his hand still on the latch, breathing, while Kelb said, "They are still there. in the manner of a machine reporting a fire in a room it is currently in. He opened it again. They were still there. Standing at the front, 10 paces closer than the rest, was Mila. She'd slept. That was what struck him. The hollowness was gone from under her eyes. Her shoulders had come down out of that terrible fence-post rigidity, and she stood on his ground with her chin level and her hands loose and looked at him with an expression he could not read at all. It was not gratitude. It was not apology. It was closest to the look a surveyor gives a hillside she has already measured. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was low and dry. "You have 41 guests." 41. "Yes. I have 41 tubers." "Then you've been counting," said Mila, "which is helpful, because so have we." Behind her, one of them, young, all elbows, with a face built for insolence, said something in a language like water over stones, and 3 others made a sound that in any species on any world is a snort of laughter. Mila did not turn around. Mila had the specific stillness of a woman who has decided not to lose the argument she hasn't started yet. "You'd better come in," Daniel said. "You. Just you. That's not how it works anymore." "Then explain to me how it works, because from where I'm standing—" "You gave me food," Mila said. "Freely, without price named, asked, or implied, to a destitute Ashani, in your own house, from your own hand, at your own table." She said it like a clerk reading a docket, each clause snapped off. "Do you know what that is?" "Dinner. It's hearthright." She let it sit. "You made an offer of household. Under the Vashti Conquered, Article 11, subsection Chirash, which your people translated as residual custom, because they didn't think it was worth the ink." Daniel's stomach had gone somewhere cold and distant. He knew that treaty. Everyone on the frontier knew that treaty in the vague way people know the shape of a scar on someone else's face. The Vashti Concord was the document that had, in 11 pages of beautiful, clean language, defined the Ashani as a displaced phenomenon, a thing that occurs, like a dust storm or a bad season, rather than a people who occur to themselves. Phenomena cannot own land. Phenomena cannot hold contracts. Phenomena can be moved along, and had been, for 100 years, from rock to rock across 4 systems. "They left one clause," Mila said, "just the one, because it cost nothing, and it made the signing look merciful. A phenomenon can't hold property, but an Ashani given hearthright freely by a landholder becomes household. Household is a person. Household has standing." She tilted her head very slightly. "Nobody has invoked it in 96 years. "Why not?" "Because no one has ever qualified," said Mila. "You have to be starving, and you have to not ask. And they have to give it anyway, knowing nothing, expecting nothing, wanting nothing back. If you ask, it's charity, and charity is a transaction, and a transaction has a price, and a price makes you cargo again." Something moved behind her eyes. "Do you know how many doors that is?" "I've walked this frontier for 2 years, 906 doors. 600 of them opened. Every one of them wanted something first. A name, a story, a reason. What are you? Where are you from? What happened to you? Why should I?" She shrugged one shoulder. One door didn't ask. The wind came around the house and found its usual 11 gaps. "You tested me," Daniel said. "Yes. You walked in here and sat at my table and ate my food, and the whole time you were—" He heard his own voice climbing and hated it. "You were running a conformance check." "Yes," Mila said, perfectly level. "I was starving, too. Both things were true at once. That's most days." "You could have told me." "If I'd told you, it wouldn't have counted." She stepped forward once, and the whole gray field of women behind her seemed to lean a millimeter, like wheat. "That's not a technicality, Daniel. That's the entire clause. The gift has to be free. The second I explain what it's worth, it isn't a gift, it's a purchase, and you're a man buying 41 people for the price of a pot of stew. Which, and here her mouth did something that wasn't a smile, is exactly the sort of arithmetic that got us here in the first place. He had nothing to put against that. He stood in his doorway with the cold coming in, and he had absolutely nothing, and the worst of it, the genuine, ringing, humiliating worst of it, was the thing sitting underneath his outrage like a stone under thin soil, which was that she was right about him. If she had asked, standing there in the dusk with her ears notched and her hands open, if she had said, "Sir, I represent 900 displaced persons and require your legal signature," he'd have said no. Politely, kindly even. He'd have given her a meal and a bed and sent her off in the morning and gone back to his slate and his boxes drawn around numbers, and he'd have felt fine about it for about 6 years. She hadn't lied to him. She'd simply declined to give him the chance to be the man he actually was. "Well," said Kelb, into the silence, at a volume that could have been heard from orbit. "Shall I prepare the fields?" "Kelb, I have run projections." The drone rotated to face the plateau, its lens iris ticking through the ranks like an accountant with a bad heart. 41 additional persons, 11 days of stores becomes 5 hours. The water situation is best described as theoretical. We have 1 latrine. A pause. I wish to say that again with feeling. 1 latrine. The young one with the elbows said something else. This time even Mila's mouth twitched. What did she say? She said your machine is the first one of you that's told the truth all morning. Daniel looked past her, out at them. 41 women standing in the gray at the frayed edge of everything, who had crossed a wilderness on the rumor of a stranger who set a second plate. Not one of them was moving. Not one of them was coming closer. They were waiting, with that same awful patience Mila had shown across his table, waiting for the catch, waiting for the price, waiting for the door to shut, because it always did. 11 days of food, 41 tubers. He could do the arithmetic in his sleep. He had done arithmetic exactly like it in his sleep, every night, for 9 years. "Right," he said, and the word came out of him from somewhere he'd nailed shut. "The East Field's dead, so nobody stand on it out of politeness. There's a well head under the North Stones that hasn't worked since before I got here." He stepped back from his own doorway and made himself say it. "And somebody's going to have to help me dig a second latrine." The second latrine was dug by nightfall, which Daniel considered a miracle until he learned that the woman who'd organized the digging had once run a mining sump crew on Vashti Secundus and regarded a latrine as a beneath her sort of hole. Her name was Eleanor. She was old in a way that had nothing to do with frailty, gray at the temples, gold gone to the color of old brass, with hands like a bundle of tools left out in the weather, and she took one look at Daniel's East Field, crouched, scooped up a handful of what he had personally written off in his ledger as gravel with opinions, smelled it, and said something short. "She says it isn't dead," Mila translated. "It's been dead 3 years. She says it isn't dead, it's sulking." A pause, while Eleanor added a footnote at some length. "She says the previous owner poisoned the top 40 centimeters with a nitrogen salt because he was in a hurry, and everything under that is fine, and that a man who plants in a poisoned crust and then blames the ground is a man who blames the ground. Tell her the previous owner was a corporation." Eleanor didn't need the translation. She laughed, one dry bark, and went to find a spade. The wellhead under the North Stones was worse and better. It went down 11 meters to a fossil aquifer that had been sealed since before anyone's grandmother, and the sealing had been done by the Kesset Development Authority, an entity whose surviving works suggested a deep and abiding institutional hatred of maintenance panels. The pump housing was welded shut, not bolted, welded, over the access hatch, with a plate that had a serial number and no hinge, as though the original engineer had wanted to be very sure that no one would ever again do what he had just finished doing. "Why?" said Kelb, who had been staring at it for 6 minutes. "Some questions don't have answers," said Daniel. "I reject that." They cut it open over 2 days with a torch that ran on a fuel Daniel had been saving for an emergency, on the grounds that this now qualified. Behind the plate was a fossil irrigation grid, kilometers of buried ceramic capillary running out under all 3 fields. A beautiful, obsolete thing built by people who had genuinely believed in this plateau, and which had been sitting there dry and perfect the entire time Daniel had been out here failing on top of it. He sat back on his heels and laughed until it wasn't laughing anymore, and nobody said anything, which was the kindest thing anyone could have done. The young one with the elbows was called Nova. She attached herself to Kelb within a day, which Kelb described as an unsolicited apprenticeship, and Nova described, in her rapidly improving standard, as supervising the barrel. She taught him swear words in Ashani and told him they meant good morning. Kelb greeted Eleanor with one at dawn on the 4th day, and Eleanor dropped her spade. Kelb spent the next hour demanding an explanation, and Nova spent it lying flat on the north stones, weeping with joy. "Has she corrupted my lexicon?" "Yes," said Daniel. "Good," said Kelb after some thought. "It was boring." Daniel and Mila worked the pump housing together in the evenings, which was how it happened, the way those things do, not in a moment, but in a lot of very small ones, spread out over a week, mostly involving gaskets. She had hands that knew tools. She swore at threads that were cross-cut. She had a laugh she clearly hadn't used in years, and deployed like a woman testing ice. On the 6th night, he burned a pot of the pale ridged tubers so comprehensively that Nova offered them to the field as a religious sacrifice, and Mila ate hers anyway, all of it, watching him across the table exactly the way she had the first night, except that this time, when he looked up, she didn't look away. "You didn't come here for food," he said. "No. You could have begged your way across 4 systems. Somebody would have fed you. Somebody in a city, with more than 11 days in the cellar." "Anyone would have fed me," Mila agreed. "In a city, a meal is a meal. Charity is legal there, and it means nothing." She turned her cup a quarter turn. "I wasn't looking for kindness, Daniel. Kindness is everywhere, and it's worth nothing. I was looking for jurisdiction." He waited. "Hearthright needs a landholder," she said. "Not a citizen, not a good man. A landholder with a patent on soil the Concord has surveyed and filed. There are maybe 200 of you left out here on the frayed edge, and every one of you chose this place because you wanted to be left alone, which means every one of you would rather chew off your own arm than sign anything." She looked up. "I needed a man who owned dirt and had no idea what he was worth. 600 doors opened. Not one of them was standing on land. And I'm standing on land." "You're standing on the only land on this road," said Mila, "and you don't even like it." It was Eleanor, up on the north stones with a spade, who saw the plume first. She whistled once, and every gold head on that plateau turned at the same instant with the terrible synchronized speed of a people who had learned exactly one lesson very well. A dust plume on the freight road, coming closer, and then, impossibly, in 9 years, for the first time, slowing. The vehicle was a low-gray Concord Line Factors crawler, clean in a way nothing out here was ever clean, and the man who stepped out of it had a smile like a printed receipt, correct, legible, and generated automatically. He was younger than Daniel expected. He wore a coat that had never once been mended. He looked at the 41 women standing in the dead east field with the mild, pleased expression of a man finding his luggage exactly where he left it. "Adrian," he said, putting out a hand. "Factor, Concord Line, Kesset Circuit, you'd be the householder." He glanced past Daniel's shoulder at the pump, the trench, the resurrected grid, and his smile did something almost affectionate. "You've been busy. That's good. I like to see initiative. It makes the conversation shorter." He opened a folder. It was real paper, and Daniel felt the sight of it in his back teeth. "There's no easy way to say this," said Adrian, "so I'll say it politely instead. These 41 individuals are pledged collateral against an outstanding transit obligation. Principal, interest, and carriage since the Vashti evacuation." He turned the page around so Daniel could see it, which was, Daniel understood immediately, the cruelest thing he'd done all day. "Call it 4 million and change. It compounds daily, I'm afraid. It's been compounding since before any of us were born." Daniel did not look at the number. He looked at the box drawn around it. It was a neat box, clean corners, one clean line, ruled rather than freehand, and in the bottom right, tucked half a centimeter in from the edge where it wouldn't interrupt the eye, a small notation field for the reconciling clerk's mark. He knew the box, he knew the field. He knew why it was half a centimeter in and not a full one, because a full one wasted paper across 10,000 forms, and a man with a stylus and a bad night had worked that out once, sitting in a corridor that smelled of recycled air and had felt briefly, horribly proud of himself. "That's a Kesset Standard obligation schedule," Daniel said. His voice came out from somewhere far away and slightly to the left. "It is." Adrian looked pleased, the way a man is pleased when a dog does a trick. "You've an eye." "No," said Daniel. "I wrote it." The wind went around the house and found its 11 gaps. "I'm sorry," said Mila. "Say that again." He didn't turn around. He could feel her behind him, and Eleanor beyond her, and 40 gold faces out in the dead east field, all of them still, all of them waiting for the catch the way they had waited for it for 100 years. He'd wanted to say it 1,000 times, out loud, to somebody, and now that the moment had opened up under him, he found he'd never once rehearsed the words, because rehearsing them would have meant believing this day would come. "9 years ago," he said, "I was a ration clerk on the Anselm Reach." Behind him, something small happened to the sound of the plateau. It wasn't a gasp. It was 41 people not breathing at the same time. "That's the transport that took your people off Vashti." He said it to the folder, because he could not say it to her. 11,000 births, rated. 19,000 souls on the pad and a star going bad in the sky, and 11,000 births. Life support was allocated per registered passenger, hard-coded, licensed, audited from Kesset, and the audit was the thing that would kill us, because if you overload a passenger allocation, the system flags it and locks the whole manifest until a magistrate signs off, and there wasn't a magistrate within 9 days and we had 4 hours. He heard his own cadence, the flat, efficient rhythm of a man giving a report, and hated it, and couldn't stop it. So a clerk on the night watch found a way. Passengers have allocation. Freight doesn't. Freight has volume. If you reclassify 8,000 people as cargo, the system stops asking questions, the doors open, and 19,000 people go up instead of 11. "You saved them," said Adrian brightly. "Genuinely. It's in the commendation file." "Shut up," said Daniel without heat, and Adrian, to his credit or his amusement, shut up. 8,000, Mila said. 8,406. On the manifest as freight. As manifested bulk, class 4, unpressurized tolerant. He made himself turn around then, and it was worse than he'd imagined because she wasn't angry. She was doing arithmetic. He watched her run it, and he watched her arrive. It was supposed to be for 4 hours. It was supposed to be reversed at the receiving station by a clerk on the day watch, and the day watch never reversed it, because by then it was in the ledger, and things in ledgers are true. And then the Concord wrote a treaty around a document that said your grandmothers were volume. He heard his own voice crack down the middle like a plate. A displaced phenomenon. That's not policy, Mila. That's a typo. That's a man being clever at 3 in the morning because he was frightened, and 96 years of lawyers building a house on top of it. The silence went on long enough to have a shape. "You have been out here," Mila said slowly, For 9 years, alone, on a dead plateau, counting tubers. 41, said Daniel, and you never told me. I was going to. When? She wasn't shouting. He wished to God she'd shout. Which evening, Daniel? The one where we cut the pump housing, where I told you about the 600 doors. She took a step and stopped herself, and it was the stopping that gutted him. I have spent 2 years learning to tell the difference between a man who feeds you and a man who's feeding something in himself. That was my whole trade. That's all I did. Her jaw worked. So tell me, that second plate, was it for me? Or was it for the 8,406? He opened his mouth. Nothing came out of it, because there was nothing in there but the truth, and the truth was, I don't know. I have never known. I have been trying to find out for 9 years, and that's why I'm on this rock. She read it off his face in about a second and a half, and she nodded once, and that nod was worse than anything she could have said. Well, said Adrian into the wreckage, this is a marvelous atmosphere, and I hate to spoil it. He tugged his cuffs straight. 90 days. That's what I'm empowered to offer, and I'll say honestly, it's more than the circuit usually allows. Call it professional courtesy between men who understand paperwork. 90 days to settle, or the collateral is recovered and transported. He tucked the folder under his arm. Nobody enjoys this part, Daniel. I want you to know that. I have a daughter. Get off my land. Certainly, said Adrian, delighted. It is your land. That's rather the whole difficulty, isn't it? And he walked back to the crawler, whistling, and the crawler turned on the freight road and went away into the gray, and that was the first thing in 9 years that had ever stopped at Daniel's house and then left again. Nobody moved for a while. Then Eleanor came down off the north stones with her spade over her shoulder, spat professionally into the poisoned crust, and said something long. Daniel didn't ask. He didn't have the right to ask anything. She says, Mila said at last in a voice scraped hollow, that she has been waiting 96 years for someone to explain how it happened. A pause. And that everyone always told her it was history, weather, nobody's hand. Another pause, longer. She says it's a great relief to learn it was a man, because a man knows where he put the tools. Daniel looked up. Eleanor was already looking at him, brass-colored, unbothered, ancient, and she raised one weathered hand and tapped twice the place on her own temple where a serial number would go if a person were a crate. She says, You filed us. Mila's mouth was a thin line. So go and get the file. The Kesset Transit Depot sat 400 kilometers up the freight road at a place the maps called Senate Halt, and the road called Nothing at All. It had been built to handle 19,000 people in 4 hours, and had done so once, and had never been asked to do anything again. Now it was a long, low shed of fused gravel and dead lighting rigs with the doors standing open to the wind, full of dust that had come in and lain down and made itself at home. Daniel had been avoiding this building for 9 years with the thoroughness of a man avoiding a mirror. I am not afraid, Kelb announced, from behind his left knee. Nobody said you were. I mention it only because my treads are slow. This is lubricant. It is a lubricant matter. Understood. I would also like the record to show that the dark is fine. Nova, 3 paces ahead with a lamp, said something in a Shawnee that made the drone rotate 90 degrees in mute outrage, and then translated it herself, generously. I said the barrel is brave, very brave, bravest barrel. They went in. The records vault was at the back, past the mustering hall where 8,000 people had been walked through a door marked with a stencil that said Freight Intake, and Daniel did not stop walking, and did not look at the stencil, and knew for the rest of his life exactly what shade of orange it was. The vault door was a Kesset Development Authority product, which meant it had been welded shut by someone who hated the future. Kelb burned through it in 40 minutes, complaining the entire time about his lubricant. Inside, ceramic wafer stacks in a cold rack, humming faintly, still on. 96 years of power drawn from a solar cap on a roof nobody had ever come back to check. The Concord had not preserved this out of conscience. It had preserved it because deletion required a form. He found the Anselm Reach manifest in 11 minutes. He knew the file naming convention. He'd argued about it. And there it was, in his own compressed clerical hand, time-stamped 0314 hours. The Night Watch. 8,406 entries. Reclassified, from passenger to manifested bulk, Class 4. His initials at the bottom, the neat box, the half-centimeter notation field. "There," said Nova quietly, all the elbows gone out of her. "That's my grandmother. That line. That's her. Yes, she's a crate." "Yes," said Daniel. Then he stopped. He read it again. He read the column beside it, the one he hadn't looked at in 9 years because he had never been able to get past the first, and something in his chest turned over like a pump catching. "Nova." "What?" "Cargo," said Daniel very carefully. "Doesn't pay freight." She stared at him. "Freight is billed to the consignor." He was talking too fast now, his hands moving. "That's the whole architecture. A crate doesn't owe money. A crate can't owe money. A crate isn't a party to anything. It's the subject of the contract. Your people have been billed 4 million credits for their own transit, but if they're passengers, they owe a fare, and if they're cargo, the shipper owes the carriage, and the shipper was the Vashti Provisional Authority, which dissolved in the evacuation." He looked up with his eyes burning. "The Concord Line has spent 96 years collecting a debt from a shipping container. They can't have it both ways. Either your people and the treaty's void, or your freight and the bill's void. They wrote both. They wrote both. And nobody ever read the 2 pages next to each other." "Why not?" said Kelb. "Because it was profitable not to," said Daniel, "and because the only man who knew where to look was hiding on a rock counting potatoes." Circuit Magistrate Victoria heard the claim 11 days later under a canvas awning that snapped in the wind like a thing trying to leave. She was 60, sun-cured, and had the particular calm of a woman who holds court on a plateau because there is no courthouse, and has decided this is fine. 41 Ashani stood in the dust behind Daniel. Adrian sat on a folding chair with his folder on his knee and his coat immaculate, and he was still smiling, though it had lost some of its print quality. "Your Honor," he said, "the classification was clerical, a wartime expedient. It was never intended to reflect the substantive legal character of the—" "Stop," said Victoria. "Stop there. I want to be sure I have you." She leaned forward. "You're telling this court that a Concord Line document, filed, sealed, and relied upon by your firm for 96 years to invoice these women, does not accurately reflect reality." Adrian opened his mouth. "Because if the document's wrong," Victoria went on sweetly, "I'll void it, and everything built on it, including your treaty. And if it's right, they're cargo, and cargo does not pay its own freight." She let the wind fill the pause. "Would you like to tell me which of your company's papers are reliable, Factor? Take your time. I've got all afternoon and there's genuinely nothing else out here." Adrian looked at his folder for a long moment. Then he did something Daniel almost respected. He laughed once under his breath, like a man who has just noticed the drop. "The obligation is discharged," said Victoria, and made a mark. "Concord Line, Kesset Circuit, take nothing." It should have felt like fireworks. It felt like a pump finally catching after 11 meters of dry pipe. A lurch, a shudder, and then the strange silence of water moving somewhere you can't see. "And the treaty?" said Mila. Victoria set down her stylus. She was not unkind. That was somehow worse. "Voided," she said. "Article 11 and everything hanging off it. You're not a phenomenon anymore. Congratulations." She looked out at 41 gold faces in the gray. "You're persons, which means you now have the full and equal right to stand on land you do not own, in a jurisdiction with no obligation to house you, holding no patent, no charter, and no claim." She began packing her case. "It's a real victory. I want you to understand that it's real. It's just not a roof." Nobody cheered. The wind went on sanding its 3 rocks. And Eleanor, who had been silent through the entire proceeding, tipped her head back, looked at the empty gray sky over the plateau for a while, and laughed, and laughed, and laughed. Daniel found it at 2 in the morning, which was traditional. He was sitting at his table with the homestead patent spread out under the lamp, the actual document, the one thing he owned, printed on real stock because the Kesset Development Authority had believed in paper the way other people believed in God, and he was reading it for the first time in 9 years. He'd read it once before, in an office, with a stylus in his hand and his heart shut, and he'd read exactly the part that said, allocation, soul, and stopped there, because that was the part he'd come for. There were 4 more pages. Nobody ever reads 4 more pages. That was the entire business model of the frontier. Thought. Clause 9. A householder holding sole patent adjacent to a designated public freight corridor may charter, at his discretion and without further application, a way station for the reception, provisioning, and shelter of travelers upon that corridor. Charter conveys standing to the household in perpetuity, jointly and severally to all named co-holders. He read it 4 times. Then he sat back and laughed, one dry bark that sounded so much like Eleanor that it frightened him, because the joke was 96 years old, and it had been sitting in his own drawer the entire time. They hadn't put it there out of kindness. They'd put it there because a road needs water and the authority hadn't wanted to pay for the wells. Hearthright wasn't the sentence. Hearthright was the first word of the sentence. He signed it at dawn with 41 other names underneath his, in a wind that tried to take the paper twice. Nova wrote hers in enormous letters and used up more than her share of the line. Eleanor signed hers, looked at it, and then made a second mark beside it, small and old, and not in any alphabet Daniel knew, and did not explain, and never did. "You understand what this is," Mila said, holding the corner down with 2 fingers. "Co-holding, not tenancy. You don't get it back. There is no clause where you get it back." "I know. 9 years, Daniel." "I know exactly how many," he said. "That's the problem." And here was the thing he had not expected, the thing nobody warns you about. It didn't hurt. He'd braced for it to hurt. He had come out here and bought a rock with both hands specifically so that there would be one column in the universe that was his and balanced and closed, and he signed it away in 11 seconds and felt the strangest sensation move through his chest, which he eventually identified with some embarrassment as nothing. Just wind. Just an empty place where an ache used to sit doing arithmetic. You cannot count what isn't yours. It turns out that's not a loss. It's a day off. Adrian came back once, in the spring, because the freight road was the freight road, and there was nowhere else to buy water. He stood in the yard and looked at the way station charter nailed up by the door, 42 names weathering already, and at the trench crews and the east field coming up green in rows, and the sign Nova had painted, which said water, food, beds, no asking, and which Daniel had lost an argument about. "Well," he said, "you found clause 9. "I did. 96 years, and it was in a drawer." Adrian shook his head slowly, and his smile, when it came, had finally stopped printing and started being a smile. "Do you know what I'll be doing next month? Auditing grain scales in Senate. Grain scales, Daniel." He put out his hand, and Daniel, after a moment, took it. "For what it's worth, and I want to be precise, because it's worth almost nothing, I'm glad. I was very good at my job. That was the trouble with it." He bought 2 liters of water and paid for it, and drove off into the gray, whistling, and that was the last anyone on the Kesset Plateau ever saw of the conquered line. Kelb was, by then, no longer an agricultural unit in any meaningful sense. He had become a maitre d'. Nova had corrupted his lexicon past recovery and then past caring, and he greeted every traveler who came off the road with an obscenity and a Shawnee delivered in a tone of tremendous warmth, and by the 2nd year there were haulers who came 400 kilometers out of their way to be insulted by a barrel. He said irrigation correctly exactly once, on a hot afternoon in the 4th year, and Nova, 20 now, still all elbows, running the pump crew, sat down in the dirt and cried, and Kelb, alarmed, never did it again, out of what Daniel was fairly certain was tact. Eleanor lived 11 more years and got her hands into every centimeter of the poisoned crust and beat it, and the tubers that came out of the east field were sweet enough that people stopped calling them sunrise gold, ironically. She's buried up by the north stones, above the aquifer, which she picked herself and considered hilarious for reasons she declined to share. And Daniel came in from the wind one evening, later than he meant to, hands stiff, dust in his teeth, having spent the day arguing with a pump housing that had been designed by a man who hated the future, and stopped in his own doorway. The lamp was lit. The room was warm. The pot was on the table and the second plate was already down, set opposite his own, half an inch out of true. Mila was sitting there with her chin on her hand, waiting, and she wasn't watching him for the catch. She'd stopped doing that somewhere in the second year, and he hadn't noticed the day it happened, which he thought was probably the whole point. "You're letting the heat out," she said. He sat down. She'd asked him, that spring, plainly, at this table, with no clause and no treaty, and no instrument of any kind behind it. Just a woman asking a man a question and being prepared to hear no. And he had said yes before she finished the sentence, which she still brought up regularly in company. Outside, the wind came around the house and found its 11 gaps, and beyond it, faintly, the sound of the road, a hauler pulling in, voices, Kelb greeting somebody filthily in a language they didn't speak, laughter, travelers stopping. Every night, travelers stopping. On the shelf above the stove, the slate sat where he'd set it down, dust on it. There was still a number on the face, if you turned it to the light, 41, and a date, and a small, neat box drawn carefully around it, closed on all 4 sides. He hadn't opened it in a year. Nobody in that house could have told you how long it had been. Nobody missed it. There's a version of this story where Daniel closes the door. It isn't a cruel version. He's tired, and the cellar is thin, and the woman on his step is a stranger, and he says sorry through the gap and means it, and goes back to his stew and sleeps fine. Nobody would call him a villain. Nobody would ever know. That version costs him nothing, and it costs him everything, and the terrible arithmetic of it is that he'd never once find out which. Because that's the thing about the door. You don't get told what's on the other side of it. Daniel didn't set that second plate because he'd calculated the odds of a 96-year-old clause. He set it because there was food and there was a person, and the gap between those two facts was unbearable to him for about 4 seconds. 4 seconds. That's the whole width of it. That's where a life turns. We like to imagine that goodness announces itself, that when the moment comes, it will come with music, and we'll recognize it, and rise. It doesn't. It comes at dusk, at the end of a long day, wearing the face of an inconvenience. It comes when you're counting what's left. And the price of the real thing is that you have to pay it blind, with no receipt, expecting nothing, or it isn't the real thing at all. It's a purchase, and purchases turn people into cargo. Mila knew that. She'd knocked on 906 doors to prove it. So here's what she left him with, and what she leaves you with. He'd spent 9 years alone on a rock trying to balance a column that would never balance, because you cannot subtract 8,000 people from your chest with arithmetic. He didn't atone by counting harder. He atoned by setting 1 more plate than he had food for, and then signing away the only thing he'd ever managed to hold. Ask yourself tonight, what's in your ledger? What's the number you keep drawing a box around, hoping the box will hold it? And who came to your door last year? Hollow-eyed, too proud to ask, while you were doing the math. You'll never know what you set in motion. That's not the tragedy. That's the offer. We've reached the end of our story, friends. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked the story, please hit the like button, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next story. See you in the next science fiction adventure.